Good evening, everyone. Our speaker this evening is Professor Joseph Camilleri, OAM. He is Emeritus Professor, La Trobe University, and Managing Director of Alexandria Agenda. He is convener of Conversation at the Crossroads, a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences, and he was founding director of the Centre for Dialogue, La Trobe University. He's author or editor of some 30 books and more than 100 book chapters and journal articles, and he is a recipient of the Order of Australia Medal. In recent years, he has convened some 20 national and international dialogues and conferences, lecturing and working with many organisations in Australia and overseas around issues of governance, cultural diversity, education, dialogue, peace and security, and human rights. He is therefore eminently qualified to address us this evening on religious persecution. I'll ask you please to welcome Professor Joseph Camilleri.
Thank you very much, David, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I have had on and off quite a long association with the Monash Interfaith Group or Gathering, and it's always an honor to be invited to be part of an event or function. I also would like to pay my respects to our First Nations, their elders, past, present, and emerging. And we all look forward to the day when justice will be done to First Nations who have never ceded sovereignty in this land. Okay, religious persecution. What a simple little topic to discuss. It's complex, of course, I'm sure you know that. It's contentious. It affects a great many people, both those who are of faith and those who are not of religious faith, but may have other beliefs that they adhere to. And to begin to give you some sense of the complexity and also the contentious nature of religious persecution, I'd like to quote just a sentence from Macaulay's Critical and Historical Essays, and I'm going to read it so that we can absorb it. I am in the right, and you are in the wrong. That's a fairly familiar position. When you are the stronger, you ought to tolerate me. For it is your duty to tolerate truth, and I stand for truth. That's what the implication is. But when I am the stronger, I shall persecute you. For it is my duty to persecute error. That, in a nutshell, encapsulates the dynamics of religious persecution. And as we shall see, today's victims of religious persecution are often tomorrow's perpetrators of religious persecution, and vice versa. So the first thing to say is religious persecution has a very long history. It's been with us from time immemorial. And it's probably true to say that there's hardly a country in the world that has escaped the impact of religious persecution at some time in its history. So let's ask the obvious question: what is religious persecution? Well, there's no simple way of getting into it. It's an activity that's usually a collective activity. Usually an act by a single individual does not class as religious persecution. So it's a collective activity the aim of which, or the impact of which, is to oppress a group of people. So it's a group oppressing another group because of their beliefs. Well, that's one take on religious persecution. In its extreme, it is a campaign by a particular group. We'll say a little more about groups. A campaign to either exterminate, drive away, or subjugate a people because of their membership of or affiliation with a religious group or belief system. At least that is the way it is seen, it is understood at face value. And these campaigns, these programs of persecution can take extremes of murder, kidnapping, detention, enslavement, exile, forced exile, and the rest. But it can also mean taking over of buildings and of assets of that particular group. It can mean intimidation, threats, persistent harassment, structural discrimination, desecration of religious sites, and of course, not just sites, but symbols, and importantly, revered personalities with a clear intention to inflict pain, loss, or humiliation. Well, that tells you something of what religious persecution, particularly systematic and prolonged persecution, usually aims to do. And this then leads us to the next question, which is the victims of religious persecution. Who are they? Well, every religious grouping, some large, some small, has experienced persecution of some kind, somewhere, sometime. There are really just about no exceptions. Muslims have experienced persecution, Christians have, Buddhists have, and the smaller groups, Sikhs and others, have as well, the Baha'i, etc. They all have, at some point, somewhere. Now, today, religious persecution in historical terms is at a fairly high level. Some say it has never been worse, but even if you don't go that far, it is pretty pronounced. It's experienced, according to the statistics available to us, in at least 50 countries in a significant way. Doesn't mean it's entirely absent from the other 150 countries, but it is it operates severely in at least 50 countries. Now, if you look at Western accounts, as reflected in our mainstream media, if you look at even Western academic work on the subject, they're usually the kinds of countries that are listed as being centers of religious persecution. Well, of course, if you're thinking Afghanistan, well, there are the Azaris come to mind immediately, a group that has some kind of Shia connection or affinity in a predominantly Sunni country. In Nigeria, which has experienced Christian-Muslim conflict for the best part of 30 to 40 years, it has been made, excuse me, much worse because of Boko Haram's contribution to the violence between these two communities, Christian and Muslim, both of which are very large in Nigeria. India is another case, not spoken so much about in the Western world, because it doesn't suit Western interests, because India is useful for countering China, and therefore you turn a blind eye to the mass human rights violations that are going on in India. With religious persecution reaching a new high, obviously it's primarily between the Hindu majority, and we'll look at the case of India in a more detail in a minute. Myanmar, of course, the Rohingya minority, which has been the ongoing subject of the most cruel persecution at the hands of Buddhist, let's call them that for the moment, elites. Pakistan, here again, there have been many instances of violence between Sunni Muslims and Hindus, Christians, Sikhs, Shias, and usually the way this is done is through a particular law which is based on the notion of blasphemous behavior, a law which punishes blasphemous behavior, and that has been used very extensively in Pakistan by various groups to accuse others of having behaved blasphemously towards the beliefs of the Sunni majority. Of course, these are extremist groups quite often, but we shall see it's not just them. And of course, various parts of the Middle East, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, which has, things have improved a bit in very recent times, but not so long ago, the 10% of Egyptians who are Christian Copts were going through a very difficult period. And of course, the Arab Palestinians who are predominantly Muslim have been dealt in the most atrocious, horrendous way by the authorities in Israel. It has been rightly declared an apartheid state. It is apartheid, possibly of a worse kind than apartheid in South Africa. You have in Jerusalem Palestinians whose rights are totally negated side by side with citizens of Israel. Okay, so victims we found in many parts of the world. That leads us to then a different take, which is not to say what has just been referred to does not exist. It does, and it's serious. But religious persecution is in no way confined to countries in the global south. That is to say, the developing countries of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, primarily. These are the examples I've just been giving you. Religious persecution is alive and kicking in the Western world, of which Australia is part. There is massive religious persecution in France, in the United States, to a lesser extent in places like Australia and New Zealand, but it's there. And we saw it with a massacre that took place in New Zealand just a few years ago. It's there. Of course, vested interests in the West and mainstream media choose not to describe it, to portray it as religious persecution, because it doesn't sound very good for Western countries to be engaged in religious persecution. We couldn't possibly have that, could we? And the classic instance in the very recent period, in many parts of the Western world, is Islamophobia, which runs deep in many Western societies. And that, to some extent, very much includes Australia. And we know the events that brought it to the surface. It was always lurking there in the background. But the events of September 11, 2001 have brought them to the fore. And the response of Western governments to the so-called terrorist threat, and there were many terrorist attacks in Europe as well as in the United States. The response often was framed in ways which suggested that this is the kind of behavior one would expect of Muslim communities. Never stated as bluntly as I have done now, but nevertheless implied, and implied very strongly. It's probably come to the fore within the Western world, most strikingly in Europe. Partly because the Muslim minority in Europe has been increasing substantially in recent years. It's now thought to be about 50 million. 50 million Muslims in Europe, which means roughly 6 to 7% of the population in Europe. And quite a bit higher, much higher in France, where it is at least 10% and rising. Okay. So France, which is said to be the result of the French political system, which is meant to be the result of the Enlightenment, and has built over time a reasonably solid human rights infrastructure. Nevertheless, it is in France that we have seen legislation prohibiting so-called conspicuous religious symbols in public schools, aimed clearly at the Muslim community, and beyond that, of course, the wearing of clothing which conceals, it is said, the face in public spaces. So that has been legislated, and that really falls very squarely under the broad rubric of religious persecution. Doesn't mean killing, it doesn't mean imprisonment, doesn't mean those more extreme forms, but nevertheless, it is. And Muslim women, in particular, have faced very considerable violence and discrimination. I'm talking now about France, at every stage of life. Much has been written about this now, and I list there where it is experienced. In schools, professional training, access to employment. You have a European French woman applying for a particular job and a Muslim French woman applying, and clearly the access and the treatment, access to and the treatment of the person does vary significantly, quite significantly. And that's now quite established. At doctors' offices, on the streets, in hospitals, of course, restaurants, in banks, swimming pools, in the media in particular, which has consistently stigmatized Muslim women. And of course, the extremes of the media, which have taken it upon themselves to be as offensive as they can of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So that is perhaps a starker case, but it does pay to us the question, are the elements of this occurring within Australia? What are Muslim women in Australia telling us about their situation along the lines that I've been describing in relation to France? So a little overview of religious groups that are being harassed. This was the result of a detailed research and survey carried out by the Pew Research Center. And it's worth bearing in mind. You should know the Pew Research Centre. It does a lot of excellent research, but it does have a bias, shall we say, in favour of the Christian faith, a known bias in favour of the Christian faith. Nevertheless, it's very interesting that what the first two are telling us, that Christians and Muslims, even if you query quite the numbers, there's no question that they are the two largest groups in the world today experiencing persecution of one kind or another. It is not altogether surprising, given their numbers. We are talking about the Christian and Muslim faiths, which have adherents of somewhere between 1.4 and close to 2 billion people each. There's nothing that comes close to that. No other faith comes close to that in numbers. So it's not surprising that because they're just about everywhere, religious persecution is experienced. This tells us nothing about the quality, the severity of the persecution, just tells us that here are the number of countries, and it's been on the increase over the last 12 or more years, consistently on the increase. Now, the Jewish faith records a fairly high number, given that it is a remarkably small faith. Probably 20 million, not much more, as opposed to 1,400 million, or even 16 or 1,800 million. Nevertheless, it does attract some forms of anti-Semitism. Perhaps there is, in the minds of some, unfortunately, a confusion between attacks on the Jewish faith and attacks on the state of Israel. And the two are quite different. You can be very critical of the Australian government, what the Australian state does, without necessarily being critical of the particular beliefs, religious beliefs of the people involved or of the wider community. But those two tend at times to be conflated, and that muddies the picture to some extent. It may also explain the high number of countries which experience, where Jews are said, according to this survey, to experience religious persecution. And you can see that the others are much smaller for two reasons. One, their numbers are smaller, but more importantly, Buddhist population is concentrated in a much smaller number of countries. So there is a great limit to how much persecution in terms of number of countries smaller communities are likely to experience. It's true of both Buddhism and Hinduism. Okay. Now, who are the perpetrators of persecution? Well, the first and the most obvious, not always the most important, but it is important, are states. And when we say states, whether it's North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Myanmar, we are talking of the political elites or the military elites that happen to be in control of that country at a given time. So that's what is meant by states, those who hold the power of the state in their own hands. And therefore, what states do by way of legislation and punishment, legislation, administration of the law and punishment can be very significant factors, and they are in religious persecution. But both religious minorities and majorities, religious majorities, can be the target of violence by non-state actors, by extremist groups of all kinds, fanatical groups, extreme nationalist groups, populist groups, fundamentalist groups, and we've seen that in just about all parts of the world Africa, Asia, Middle East, and in Western countries. There has been, in line with what I was saying a moment ago, there has been in Europe a tremendous upsurge of the extreme right, right? And the resurgence of Nazi groups who can command up to 10% of the vote, and in some cases not Nazi groups, but extreme right, who have support of a much higher number. And now we're beginning to see extreme right governments in Europe. And even though they don't publicly support or identify with religious persecution, nevertheless, those who operate at a lower level, not the leadership level, are given the encouragement and the support to target a number of religious communities, of which the most obvious and most important has been Muslim communities in various European countries, and I've already spoken about that. So, and it's interesting, this is an important development. It can be groups of the religious majority targeting a religious minority, but it can also be small groups, terrorist groups, targeting a religious majority. And that is happening in several countries. So the perpetrators are varied. And there is another factor here. When we say states, we mean primarily political and military elites. But these political and military elites are very often supported, at least privately, by strong economic and financial interests. There are economic and financial interests which do a roaring business out of religious persecution. Got to keep that in mind. It's not just what you see, it's layers upon layers behind what is the facade of state government activity. So the case in India, because it's so interesting. Over the last 20 years or more, there has been a significant rise in what is called Hindutva ideology. That is to say, an extreme Hindu nationalism that regards itself as superior to all other religious minorities in India, that regards the secular state, which was created immediately after independence, with a view to protecting all religious groupings, as having done great damage to Hindu identity, to Hindu self-confidence, and to Hindu interests, and to the Hindu faith. And therefore, the argument goes, it is time for reassertion of the Hindu faith, of the Hindu culture, and of Hindu power in India. And, excuse me, this has come to the fore with the coming to power of the BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party, which has contributed directly to the rising tensions between, in particular, the Muslims of India, and they're a very, very large group of people, right? It's probably the second largest grouping of Muslims in any country after Indonesia. But also, not just Hindus and Muslims, but also Christians, Sikhs, and other smaller groups, the religious groupings in India. So just in the last 4 years, there have been at least 2,900, other estimates say 3,500 incidents of communal and religious rioting, in which those religious minorities I've just mentioned have been at the receiving end of the violence. Hindu festivals are increasingly marred by communal violence aimed primarily against Indians, often deliberately coinciding with the holy month of Ramadan. And that also explains the tensions in Kashmir, poor relations between India and Pakistan, and so on. But as I said, it's not just Muslim, and just as the first half of last year, there were 300 attacks recorded against Christian communities, gatherings, and in particular churches, and the burning of several churches. That's what you're not going to see a lot of if you read the mainstream press in Australia or most other Western countries. At the moment, it might change. So the question arises, what's behind religious intolerance and persecution? What drives it? Why do we have it in the first place? Well, religious differences are, of course, important. And some people who are not used to handling difference are affronted by your belief, by someone else's beliefs who might be different from my own. Okay? I'm uncomfortable. I don't like it. Please go away. And if you don't go away, we'll push you. That kind of attitude. Religious difference does account for some of the factors that drive religious persecution. But I want to tell you, to suggest that there are other factors which are more important. And that's why it's often said, and rightly, that religious persecution is often not religiously motivated, but politically motivated. Because those who are in positions of power believe they have much to gain from promoting, fostering religious intolerance. What do they have to gain? It helps to solidify their support base. It builds up what's called extremist enthusiasm and helps, therefore, in what's called regime survival. Modi is a classical example of this, that he has used this fostering of strong feelings of Hindu assertion and nationalist expression to solidify his rule for well over 10 years now, and will not be easily dislodged, for better or for worse. Then there is the historical dimension, where there is a long record of uneasy relationships between two faith communities. It's very difficult to get around it. And though there have been many, many instances in many parts of the world where Christians and Muslims have got on very well, what some people seem to know more of, be more familiar with, is when things have not gone well, when they have become rather unpleasant, when there has been violence, when there has been examples of bigotry and intolerance. And where that is widely perceived to be the case, it is very difficult to undo the weight of history, that particular part of history, and replace it with something better or different. And there are, of course, other factors which we ought to keep in mind. We need to understand all this, because unless we do, we can't really do much that's constructive about religious persecution. Very often, religious tensions are connected with ethnic differences and rivalries. Nigeria is a classic instance. The Christians come from certain tribes and the Muslims of Nigeria from different tribes. And there are all kinds of interests which are important to these competing, often conflicting ethnic communities. The power games of ruling elites I've already discussed. Economics is often very closely connected to ethnic rivalry. Some resources are scarce, land, water, and because of ethnic differences, that often then translates itself into religious differences and religious tension. And importantly, there's one other factor, and that is that the West has been dominant, as we know, across the globe ever since colonization by the major European powers over the last, let's say, 3 or 4 centuries. They have been dominant, the West has been dominant culturally, economically, politically. And there is an attempt on the part of many that have been experienced colonization to rise and assert themselves and say, we don't want any more of this. We want greater independence. We want to overcome the colonial legacy. And very often, this does have religious overtones on both sides. The Christian West, although it's less and less Christian and more secular, wanting to maintain its dominance, and those who have been subjugated wanted to overcome the dominance to which they've been subjected. To conclude, let me pose the complex question. How best do we respond? There's no simple or single solution, much as we'd love to have one. There is no magic wand. But clearly, laws that protect the rights of communities and faiths are very important. They're not the full answer, because in many cases, the powers that be can turn a blind eye to laws that exist. The laws are not properly administered. But nevertheless, to have laws that protect the rights of people and the right to expression of belief is very important. With, obviously, a qualification. It can't be unrestricted freedom. It can only be freedom that is compatible with respect for the dignity and rights of others. You can't say, this is my belief, and I'm going to express it and act on it, regardless of how it damages the dignity and rights of others. You can't do that. So there needs to be some kind of negotiation to see how the rights of all in a diverse society can be respected and protected by the law. But the law, important as it is a fragile weapon. And that is why it's not just having a secular state. By secular, we understand one thing, a very precise use of the technical meaning of secular, which does not mean anti-religious, but means all, irrespective of beliefs and convictions, can flourish in the society. There is no privilege assigned to this faith, that faith, or the other faith, or those who are of no religious faith. No privilege. They all can flourish. That's the true meaning of a secular, tolerant, humane state. Well, we need to breathe new life into that idea, because some states that call themselves secular sometimes interpret that to mean, and it's okay to be anti-religious. All right. The key at the end of the day is dialogue, and particularly those that are in conflict situations. Those who are in conflict situations have to come together, not just the leaders of the groups. It's not all that helpful just to have religious leaders coming together, having nice cups of tea or whatever else they have, and making bland statements at the end of the meeting. It doesn't really get us terribly far. It is people who occupy, who make up the faithful, whether it be in temples, in churches, mosques, or whatever. They have to be engaged in the dialogue. They have to be engaged in dialogue. Not necessarily a theological dialogue, for which they may not feel equipped, but a dialogue which goes into the cultural, religious interests of the people they are dialoguing with, prepared to listen to their concerns, their grievances, and vice versa, and begin to establish a relationship based on mutual respect. Based on mutual respect. And that includes not just those of different religious persuasion, but it also includes those who do not have a religious persuasion, whether they be atheist or agnostic or whatever they may be, humanists, whatever they are, they need to be an integral part of the dialogue. Difficult at times, but essential. And the reality is that dialogue does not grow on trees. It is very difficult. It is emotionally taxing. It requires skill. It requires perseverance. We have to train people for dialogue. We have to accustom them to the idea of dialogue, the practice of dialogue, the method of dialogue. This is one of the critical needs of our time in Australia as anywhere else. We have to understand that humility is needed. No faith has an absolutely clean record, none. They all have committed egregious misdeeds in their history, and we all have to acknowledge them. We all have to acknowledge them. And that comes to my last point. Where there is a case of religious persecution, and as we've seen, there are many of them. Of course, it's perfectly reasonable and sensible for those who are experiencing persecution to voice the persecution that they are experiencing, of course. But it's not very enough. It's nowhere near enough. What we need, and that's where the dialogue comes in, is for those who are fellow believers, of those who are perpetrators of persecution, to be called out by their fellow members. That's what's needed. If there are Muslims being harassed, attacked, discriminated, then those who belong to the group in some way that meets out that harassment or discrimination have to come out in public and say, that's not us. That is not Christianity. That is not true humanism. That is not true agnosticism at its highest level. In other words, it's very important for those who are in any faith to be willing to run the risk of accusing their own fellow believers of mischief when they are in fact responsible for mischief. Christians must point the finger at fellow Christians who may be responsible. Muslims must point the finger at fellow Muslims who are responsible, and so on and so on. They have to feel increasingly isolated, that they don't even have the support of their own communities at large. Now, I know this is a tall order. It's very difficult, and understand it can only come from dialogue. And of course, when one calls a crime, calls out the crime, one does it in a way that's hateful, in a way that is offensive. One has to do it with tact, one has to do it with skill, and one has to do it with some empathy for whatever the grievances might be, which are leading to certain kinds of unfortunate actions. So there's a great deal to do, And Australia being such a culturally diverse society, one of the most, admittedly, many of the culturally diverse communities are small, but nevertheless, we have just about every culture, ethnicity, and religion are reflected to some extent in our community. And therefore, the opportunities for us to develop forms of relating to others in ways that are thoughtful, respectful, and empathetic is going to be the key to the success of Australia's multiculturalism. And in this, we have a long way to go, but with the likes of the Monash Interfaith Gathering, there is much reason to be hopeful.
Hello. Hi, I have a question. No, we are asking questions. Wait 1 minute. In the program. Thank you, Joe, for that lovely explanation of religious persecution. Sorry, before Heather tells me. we have a little bit of time, but 10-15 minutes for questions and answers. And I call upon Kamla to moderate. If all your questions are not answered today, you can email us and probably we can send it to you shortly. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Camilleri, for a very powerful and thought-provoking presentation today on this topic, religious persecution, that we all are concerned about. And we are all thinking of what we can do to ensure that some difference can be brought about. Now, I'm sure the attentive audience will have quite a number of questions. So what I would suggest is if you can please raise your hand and we will give you a chance to ask. So gentlemen over here, can you just ask your question?
Divine, I think it's very important, the things you've mentioned, Joseph, it's very important, very significant. But I think we've also got to reach the heart. We've got to reach out of our hearts. And I think that there are community groups that have to do a lot of the things that you've mentioned. But I think the individual has great scope and great potential to be a leaven, a conduit, and a bridge builder to create a better world. I've found over the last 20 or more years, I've spoken to all the people I meet at Waverley Garden, and now I'm doing it at the Glen. I'm an ex-Catholic priest. I studied 4 years here, 6 in Rome. I lived with a community of 400 people of 45 nationalities. And I think it's important that we reach out to people, engage with people, connect with people. And I think the churches have done quite a bit. But as a Catholic, I feel so saddened that the Catholic Church is so ignorant. Many of us are ignorant about the beliefs of other people, their culture and so on. I think it's important that we reach out and connect. I wear t-shirts. The first was smile, say hello, and make a difference. And that's really, people notice it and talk about it. Another one, we are all one family. Another one is what I'm wearing tonight. We must look after each other. The earth needs our love and care, and together we can create a better world. And I've found talking to people at the Glen, we've been living here for about 3 months now, and also before at Waverley Garden, I've spoken to every person I've seen. I go up to the Muslims and I say, it's lovely to see you. I say, how are you? And I listen. And I give them a chance to tell me how they are. And I don't have any expectations. I see all of us as participating in a beautiful tapestry, a beautiful jigsaw. No one has all the answers. We all have something to contribute. Very valid. I have never, as a priest, former priest, tried to change anyone. Never. And I accept people as they are. I value their experience, their belief system. And you meet people who are in need. We met a family, a Pakistani family some years back. They were struggling financially. We took their daughter in for 5 or 6 months, free of charge. We could all do things like that. And we've become great friends. And you just talk to all these people and the impact is extraordinary.
Thank you.
We all do something.
Thank you. before I let Professor to comment on that, if you want to, can I just say that we've got quite a number of questions. There are some audience online as well. So if you can keep your contribution brief, it will be very, very helpful. Thank you. I think there's a question now online.
Yes, a question online, and this is a quote, I believe, from one of your colleagues, Dr. Mazafar. And the quote is, "Zionist power in the media, including the new media channels, is obvious. The top stratum of leading universities also reflects Zionist presence and influence. Hollywood and the entertainment industry as a whole is another example of subtle Zionist influence." And the question is Mr. Camilleri's colleague, Dr. Mazafar, use of the word Zionist simply another way of referring to Jews?
You want to answer? The short answer is no. It is not another word for Jews. Any more than the people, and there were numerous, who perpetrated atrocities in Nazi Germany were commenting on Germans, full stop. So this is what I was saying before. It is very important to distinguish between the Jewish faith, the religious faith, based one of the three Abrahamic faiths, and the political project of the creation of Israel and the way that has developed since its formation. To be critical of what has happened there is no argument against the Jewish faith. It is merely an argument about the unsatisfactory political nature of the decisions that have been made in the name of the State of Israel. Two different worlds.
Thank you. Thank you. Francis, you had your hand up.
First of all, I want to say thank you for this opportunity. But I'm wondering what's happened to Baha'i place, and you're talking about the persecution, religion persecution or heresy. What's happened to us, to Baha'i people in Iran, and the Baha'i religion is not a small religion, it's a big population all around the world. But you didn't talk about Baha'i religion. And I was wondering why.
For the same reason I didn't talk much about it, many of the other smaller groups.
But we are not a small group, we are a big group, and we are going through lots of difficulties.
Yes.
Even at this time.
Yes, I know. But the point I'm making is, yes, of course, there are Baha'is in various countries, particularly you've mentioned Iran, yes, who are the subject of persecution. But I think it's very, very important for Baha'is, Christians, Muslims, etc., who are the subject of persecution, right? Who are the subject of persecution, to make common cause.
Yeah, but we like you talk about them.
Yes.
You mention their name and people that they can hear you.
Yes.
You know what we are. I'm one of the witnesses. I have to escape. Whatever I had in Iran, I have to leave, left in Iran, and to escape from Iran.
I understand.
And they started, from zero.
Yes, I understand.
But I really appreciate that if next time you go somewhere or you're talking about religion, talk about Baha'i religion.
We will.
Be Baha'i religion voice.
We can't talk about everything every time, but I have spoken about Baha'i on more than one occasion. And I accept the fact that Baha'is in some places are the victims of religious persecution. And that's one reason why all those who face religious persecution must put the issue on the table. I agree.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Francis. We have got an online question.
Another online question. Thank you, Professor. Do you have examples of fellow believers who have achieved success in calling out intolerant believers?
Oh yes, there are many. Absolutely. In most countries, there are courageous people who do just that. But I think I have to be honest and say, whether you're looking at France or the UK or Australia or Indonesia, the countries that I'm reasonably familiar with, or the United States, those who are prepared to make their voices heard publicly, not just in the privacy of their own homes, are in the minority. That is to say, those who have the insight, the wisdom, and the courage to do that, to call out fellow Christians or fellow Muslims or fellow or whoever they may be out, is not, unfortunately, the majority that normally does it. It is a minority. Maybe it will never be a majority, but to have a sizable and growing minority must be a key objective.
Thank you, Professor. We've got the gentleman standing up.
Yeah, want to talk about I think the leaders in China were a conspicuous absence. I was wondering why, whether some reason didn't include all.
No, no reason at all. I did mention them because I didn't mention quite a lot of others. That's one of them, yes. I'm not, there is discrimination occurring. There are re-education centres, we know, to which they are compelled to attend. We know all that. There is persecution. I don't think it's because of the Muslim faith per se. I think because they see this particular minority as possibly posing a danger. I'm not saying that that's justified. And they're taking unacceptable responses, absolutely. But what I'm trying to say is the Chinese strong hand in relation to the Uyghurs is not driven so much by hostility.
Got a lot to do with education and implementation. So my question, why, in the system, in any countries, education system or political system or law system, why there is not actually a program for the kids at school? Because I totally believe middle age, mature age, we have to pass that. I am here now and I witness the third generation since I came, so I'm a grandmother, and I can tell and I can share with you that children who actually born here still suffering from some sort of racism, but I am beyond this generation. I am now looking at the grandchildren. So even as we speak now, the education program is not there. It's actually an initiative everyone has to take, and it makes difference. I have witnessed that since 2011 when we had the Arab Revolution, and I was invited to one of your conference, 2014, bilateral, and since 2011 till now, I call them the people who actually making a chance to make a U-turn. So if everyone, with an education program and open even, the place or the program, even for the people who we call them fanatic, or they having like a strict belief, I have seen them, whatever organization I actually, help with. New faces coming, they used to call those individuals, no, there's no way we're going to be in the same room. They start coming because we open for them. So when we're going to have an education program supported by the nation and the country? Thank you.
Well, you put your finger on a very, very important area. I'm sorry that I didn't do justice. In fact, I didn't say much about it at all. No, it's true. Our educational system is inadequate, to put it mildly, inadequate. And it's not just a program. You need a program, you need the curriculum, yes, but you need the right teachers. And teachers are not properly trained to do this kind of thing. If you put a program which is really based on understanding of different faiths, empathy with different faiths and different cultures. You put a program together and said to this, that, or the other teacher, now go ahead and do it, they would find it very difficult because they have not been trained. But it's worse than that. Those who trained the teachers at universities are not trained. That's the problem. So it is structural. And the universities are like that because there is no push from government for it to be like that. So it affects schools. It goes from kinder right to all the levels of secondary and higher education. So yes, and I think groups like this one have a very important role to play. I've been saying this to a number of groups. You need to bring teachers together. You need to bring those who train the teachers together and ask them to account themselves. What do they do in this area? And if they're not doing much, why not? Ask them very probing questions, but you better have them in the room, okay? And hopefully, if invited, some at least would come. And some would be sympathetic. And the question is, what can we do between, let's say, what role can faith-based groups, interfaith groups, parents and teachers working together, at least some of them, what can they do to move in this direction? It's very important. Education is central to the total answer, the key part of the whole answer.
We have time just for 2 more questions. So we have one from this side. Yes,
Yes. Look, I think it's time we stop persecuting teachers. I've trained teachers for 40 years. I taught cross-cultural communication, multicultural studies, multicultural Australia, how to manage cultural diversity, and I was very proud of all the students I taught and the commitment they made to that subject. However, they go out into a society where a premier is proud to say, don't take any notice of teachers, they don't know what they're talking about. Where football stars and other people who get overpaid for what they do make racist comments and act in discriminatory ways. It's very hard for a teacher to battle against a system which sprouts commitment to multiculturalism but doesn't believe it. And that's been the Australian problem since assimilation was abolished about 50 years ago. It's still deep in the heart of governments and many Australian citizens. They cannot accept that this is a multicultural society. They cannot accept cultural diversity, and they just talk the talk, but they don't carry it through. And I think that many teachers who put their lives into learning how to handle diversity in the classroom feel quite betrayed by the system. And I get very annoyed when people criticise teachers because they don't know what they're talking about.
If I can just add on to that, I have been in the classroom for almost half a century, and I've taught in Fiji as well as here in Australia. And I can very well sympathize with you and understand and agree with quite a number of comments that you have made over there, that as soon as the topic of religion comes up in the school, there has to be complete no-go, because we don't have students from just one particular religious background. We have from quite a number of them, and the parents sort of rise up that, you know, we don't want religion or a particular religion to be given prominence or taught. So that is something that we have never ever been encouraged to bring up in the classroom. So it's a lot of issues over there.
Just a very quick comment. I understand perfectly what you're saying, but I think I have done a lot of work with teachers and with people in the academic area as well as the school area. Those in your case and those like you, I think I have to say, are a minority. And it's not just what an individual teacher does, because the teacher, and you're a wonderful example of that, who tries to do the right thing, is facing an uphill battle if the entire culture of the school is not geared in the same way. You become a fringe minority. So what we need is a new culture that permeates the entire educational system, and that means training It means the training of people in sport, in art, in every field. It means apprenticeships. There should be no apprenticeships where that's not done. All forms of training, including training on the work site, should have an important element of cultural, intercultural, and education, which brings with it knowledge and understanding and empathy for people of different faith backgrounds, and knowledge, some knowledge of that as well. So yes, I agree with you, it's a whole of society issue, but I think education is where I mention it because I do see possibilities which could be developed further, but it requires community groups that have a vested interest in this area to assist and prod and support what can be done, even on a small scale, in the educational arena. And let's forget, 50% of all Year 12 students go to university. At least more than 50% now. It's got to be right there too. And it's not. I've been in it for 50 years, and I can tell you, different universities. The simple fact is, this is part of a wider problem. Our educational system as a whole, as opposed to marvellous individual teachers, is not equipped to train and educate a new generation who are able to live in the world that we currently have. There's so much emphasis on results and on getting through to university and then landing the so-called good job, and not enough on what kind of society do we have and what kind of society should we aim for. That needs to be made front and center of the educational experience.
Thank you. We have time only for one more question.
Because
One
we
more
have to,
question, the last
sorry,
one.
We have to give the hall by 9 o'clock.
Yes.
We
So-
have to vacate, clean and
Yes.
leave the hall. But please write your questions and we will send it.
I've had my hand up for about the
Last question and then all right.
Thank you. And thanks very much, Joe, for your important message of tolerance. And just building on the questions about education, we've been talking about skilling up individual teachers, but I'm concerned about the whole school system where we segregate children on the basis of religion. I'm wondering whether there's a case for the dissolution or the absorbing of religious private schools into the state system, so a Sikh kid can have lunch with, sit next to a Christian kid. A Christian kid can sit next to and dialogue, we're talking about dialogue with a Muslim kid during the day. So we're not I mean, the hope is with the next generation. We've got to build tolerance into the next generation. So I'm wondering whether there's an argument for the dissolution of these private religious schools and have kids mixing together.
Of course, you've touched a contentious issue, right? You know that. There is merit in what you're saying, but we need to understand where we're coming from. Of course, we know there are Muslim schools and Jewish schools and a few others, but the big ones, of course, the large number, and the elite schools as well, are also called Christian. Now, to understand the scale of the problem, if we're going to even begin to move a little bit in your direction, in the direction you're advocating, Catholic and Anglican schools don't talk to each other. That's how hard it is. They're competing against each other. There is you may have seen in today's age, there is real competition between so-called elite Catholic schools and elite independent schools, which mean non-Catholic private religious schools. So there is that kind of mentality by those who run the system. So I think you're not going to dislodge it, and so long as these schools exist, you can understand while those why those of Jewish or Muslim persuasion would want to do the same, because they don't have the confidence that if they went to the public school, to a public school, those coming out, if they are from Muslim families or Jewish families or etc., would be able to come out with a proper religious formation in their particular faith. So we could aim for culturally diverse and religiously diverse schools in the public sphere if somehow there was provision made for certainly interreligious and intercultural dialogue, but nevertheless at the same time for those who were of Christian or Jewish or Muslim background to be able to develop a proper understanding of their own faith through the school and not just leave it for an hour or two for a religious class on a weekend or something. So now you would have resistance from the public system as well to that happening. So it would require an awful lot of discussion and goodwill, which at the moment doesn't exist. Doesn't mean it's worth considering, but smaller things could happen, and that is schools which are in the public spheres, in other words, state schools, and religiously based schools to have many more exchanges than they now do, serious exchanges, and even some joint teaching programs. I don't see why that can't happen. It would be a step in the right direction. Whether one can go the whole way, that is a question for the future, obviously.